Nobody expected a 21-year-old from the Philippines to walk into one of the biggest tournaments in North America and make the normal idea of home court advantage almost meaningless. Yet that is exactly what Eala has been doing. Washington felt it, Toronto felt it, Cincinnati was next, and now the person sitting at the very top of the WTA has seen enough to understand that something unusual is happening around one of the fastest rising players in women's tennis. Portia Archer had barely settled into her new job as WTA CEO when she arrived at the Linder Family Tennis Center in Mason, Ohio, expecting what any executive would expect at a WTA 1000 event: elite players, packed courts, world-class facilities, and fans watching some of the best tennis on the planet. What she encountered around Eala was different. Philippine flags were everywhere. Chants followed Eala from court to court. Matches involving a player ranked around the top 20 were beginning to generate the kind of atmosphere normally associated with established global superstars. That is why the label Crowd Queen matters. It is not merely another compliment attached to a successful season. It is recognition that Eala has developed something rankings alone cannot measure. She is not simply attracting people who want to watch tennis. She is drawing people who feel represented when she walks onto the court. And once that starts happening across multiple cities, across multiple tournaments, and against opponents who would ordinarily expect to own the crowd, you are no longer talking about one popular player having a good week. You are looking at a pattern. Archer officially took over as WTA CEO on July 29, only a couple of weeks before Cincinnati, after a career that included executive experience in basketball. Her first stretch in the role became what she described as a period of listening, learning, meeting players, attending tournaments, and absorbing the culture of the sport firsthand. She had been at the National Bank Open in Toronto before traveling to Cincinnati, giving her an unusually direct introduction to the way women's tennis operates on the ground. Archer talked about wanting to experience the sport rather than simply study it from an office. She spoke about meeting the people involved, understanding the environment, and recognizing the sense of community and family that exists inside tennis and around the WTA. That observation becomes especially significant when you look at what follows Eala, because community may be the single best word for it. Her supporters are not behaving like scattered spectators who happen to favor the same player. They arrive in groups, they bring flags, they chant together, they photograph one another. They transform practice sessions and early round matches into gathering points, and the result is visible before Eala even hits a ball. Archer has also made the fan experience one of the priorities of her new leadership, while emphasizing the importance of making the WTA the strongest possible platform for players to build rewarding careers. She entered the position at a moment when women's sports are experiencing enormous momentum, and she described that growth not as a temporary spike, but as something closer to a movement. That distinction matters. A moment disappears, a movement compounds. And if Archer wants to understand what that movement can look like at ground level, Eala's rise offers a remarkable case study. Here is a young player from a nation without a long history of producing elite singles champions, and suddenly crowds across North America are reorganizing themselves around her matches. The question is not whether the support exists. The evidence is already too obvious for that. The question is why it has become so intense, so quickly, and why it appears to travel with her regardless of geography. Miami, Washington, Toronto, Cincinnati, and other stops may be thousands of miles apart, but the scenes increasingly look familiar. Eala walks onto the court. Philippine flags rise, Filipino voices grow louder. The neutral venue begins to feel less neutral. That is the Eala effect. And Washington may have been the point where the phenomenon changed from interesting to impossible to ignore. During her breakthrough run there, Eala defeated world number 3 Jessica Pegula and became the first Filipina to win a WTA Tour-level singles title. That achievement alone would have been historic. But the way it happened added another layer. Filipino supporters turned the run into something that looked larger than a normal tournament campaign. Each victory brought more attention. More flags appeared. More people arrived expecting to witness another chapter. Tickets became harder to get when Eala was scheduled to play. The matches became events inside the event. For a player still early in her professional rise, that is extraordinary. Winning creates fans, but certain athletes trigger something stronger because people see their success as communal rather than individual. Eala is increasingly becoming that kind of athlete for Filipinos around the world. The connection is not difficult to understand. When a country has rarely seen one of its athletes reach the highest levels of a global sport, every breakthrough carries extra meaning. A victory is not only a victory, it becomes evidence that somebody from that background can belong on that stage. Suddenly, young players have a reference point they did not have before. Families who may not have followed every WTA event start tracking draws and schedules. Overseas Filipinos who discover that Eala is playing within driving distance show up with flags and friends. And every successful tournament strengthens the cycle. The athlete gives the community something to rally around. The community gives the athlete an atmosphere other players notice. Then those reactions generate more attention, which brings even more people to the next tournament. Toronto provided one of the clearest examples. Eala's following became large enough that a grandstand with roughly 2,800 seats was no longer sufficient for the demand surrounding her appearance, and organizers moved her to a larger court. Think about what that says. Tournament scheduling is normally driven by ranking, star power, matchup quality, broadcast value, and local interest. Eala was forcing organizers to account for another variable: the sheer number of people who wanted to be wherever she was playing. Washington had already shown the scale of the support. Toronto reinforced it. Cincinnati then became the next test, and Amanda Anisimova understood what was coming before she ever faced Eala. Anisimova was not some inexperienced player guessing about the pressure of a big stage. She was a top 10 American, seeded 9th in Cincinnati, with major final experience and years of high-level tennis behind her. She had reached the finals of Wimbledon and the US Open in 2025. She had won WTA 1000 titles in Qatar and China. Long before that, she had been one of the sport's elite young prospects, winning the US Open girls title and reaching the French Open semifinals as a teenager after defeating Simona Halep. In other words, packed stadiums were not new to her. Big matches were not new. Expectations were not new. Yet when she discussed facing Eala for the first time, one subject kept appearing: the crowd. Anisimova praised Eala's season, her level, and the size of her fan base. She expected a packed stadium. She expected an incredible atmosphere. Most importantly, she openly acknowledged that many of the spectators would probably support Eala rather than the American playing on American soil. Instead of complaining, Anisimova said she wanted to embrace it and feed off the energy. That response tells you how established the Eala effect had already become. Opponents were preparing for it before matches began. They were no longer simply scouting Eala's forehand, movement, patterns, and serve. They were preparing psychologically for thousands of people celebrating her points. Naomi Osaka had already compared the feeling around Eala's matches to something closer to a basketball game than a traditional tennis contest, which captures the central difference perfectly. Tennis crowds can be passionate, but they are also structured by etiquette. There are long periods of quiet, noise explodes after points, then disappears before the next serve. Around Eala, the emotional rhythm can feel different. There is anticipation before she appears. Chants build, flags create an obvious visual identity. Every momentum swing becomes communal. Former doubles world number 1 and Serena Williams coach Renee Stubbs also described the atmosphere surrounding Eala as something many players may never have experienced, outside of rare situations involving enormous stars in their home environments. That is a serious comparison. It suggests Eala's advantage is not imaginary sentiment. It can affect the competitive environment. Imagine being the nominal home player in Cincinnati and realizing that 80% of the sound after an important point is going in the opposite direction. Imagine breaking serve and hearing disappointment, then getting broken back and feeling the building erupt. Tennis is already psychologically brutal because players cannot hide behind teammates or substitutions. Every mistake belongs to you. Every momentum swing is yours to manage. Add a crowd heavily invested in the other player, and the match becomes a different mental exercise. That does not mean the crowd wins points for Eala. It does mean opponents have another variable to manage. And Anisimova knew Eala already had the game to exploit any opening. Eala had collected victories over a remarkable list of elite opponents, with 9 top 10 wins in her young career and 7 coming during the season described in the source material. That list included Iga Swiatek, Alina Svitolina, Madison Keys, Jasmine Paolini, Coco Gauff, Elena Rybakina, Jessica Pegula, and other major names. Some of those victories came more than once. Her Washington run had also taken on the feel of a revenge tour, with Eala overcoming players connected to earlier defeats and ultimately securing the biggest title of her career. So when people reduce her popularity to nationality alone, they miss half the story. Representation may explain why Filipinos connect so deeply with her, but winning is what keeps expanding the stage. Fans can make a player popular. They cannot manufacture victories over top 10 opponents. Eala has been doing both at the same time, and that combination is why the phenomenon has accelerated. She has enough competitive credibility that every match carries the possibility of another major upset, and enough emotional connection that thousands of spectators arrive believing they could witness history. That expectation changes an atmosphere. Against someone like Anisimova, the challenge also exposes why Eala's rise is compelling from a pure tennis perspective. Anisimova owns the kind of aggressive baseline power that can shorten rallies and prevent a smaller, more mobile opponent from settling into rhythm. Eala needs anticipation, speed, defensive transitions, and the courage to redirect pace rather than simply absorb it. She needs to extend points without becoming passive. She needs to create angles, disrupt timing, and remain fearless when the opponent starts dictating. Those are tennis problems, not popularity problems. But when thousands of supporters believe Eala can solve them, the psychological context changes. Every extended rally she wins becomes louder. Every comeback feels possible. Every top player across the net knows the crowd is waiting for the moment Eala turns pressure into another breakthrough. This is where home court advantage becomes such an interesting phrase. Traditionally, geography determines it. The American gets the American crowd. The French player gets Paris. The British player gets Wimbledon. Yet, Eala's following behaves more like a traveling homeland. Filipino communities already exist across many of the cities hosting major international events. Once Eala enters the draw, those communities suddenly have a reason to gather in one physical place. People who may never have met recognize the same flag, the same chants, the same reason for being there. For several hours, a tennis venue becomes something more than a sports facility. It becomes a social gathering, a cultural celebration, and a visible statement that this community is present. That is why the phenomenon reaches beyond tennis. You can see similar dynamics whenever an athlete becomes a national symbol for a diaspora. Manny Pacquiao is the obvious Filipino comparison, and Eala herself has been cautious about it. She grew up watching Pacquiao become far more than a boxer. His fights became communal events. People gathered because they were not simply following an individual athlete. They felt they were watching one of their own represent them internationally. When Eala was asked about being compared to Pacquiao, she made clear how enormous that comparison felt. She described him as a sporting legend who paved the way for Filipino athletes and said she never imagined while watching his fights that her name might someday be mentioned beside his. She also emphasized that she remains far from what Pacquiao achieved and that their journeys are different. That humility is important because there is no need to claim Eala has already matched Pacquiao's legacy. She has not. The interesting point is the similarity in the reaction. When Pacquiao fought, Filipinos gathered. When Eala plays, a smaller but increasingly visible version of that same instinct appears. Her matches become opportunities to come together, and Eala has admitted that the scale of her own rise can be difficult to process. When she was asked to identify the most surreal moment of her career, she struggled to choose between two experiences, Wimbledon and Washington. One represented victory on one of tennis's most iconic stages, including a memorable center court win over defending champion Iga Swiatek. The other represented her first WTA title. She described both as unforgettable for different reasons. One gave her the feeling of proving herself on a legendary court. The other gave her the milestone every professional remembers forever, the first trophy. Those accomplishments also brought a new burden. Eala has spoken about the strange balance of representing an entire country while still trying to develop as a young athlete. Sometimes that attention is enjoyable. Sometimes it feels heavy. That may become one of the most important parts of her next phase. Popularity is an advantage until expectation becomes pressure. Fans can give energy, but they also create a spotlight. Every defeat becomes bigger. Every slump produces questions. Every tournament feels important because thousands of people are no longer casually checking a score. They are emotionally invested. Eala now has to learn the same lesson every rapidly rising star eventually encounters. Breaking through and living as an established name are different challenges. The surprise disappears. Opponents study you more closely. Tournament directors place you on bigger courts. Media obligations expand. People expect wins that once would have been considered upsets. And because the crowds are so visible, every result gets amplified. That is what makes Archer's recognition important for the WTA itself. A governing body cannot manufacture this kind of connection on command. Marketing departments spend enormous resources trying to create exactly what Eala's supporters are producing organically: loyalty, atmosphere, identity, repeat attendance, emotional investment, and a reason for casual viewers to care about the next event. When a player begins moving ticket demand and creating recognizable crowd behavior across several markets, the sport has an opportunity. The WTA can treat it as a temporary curiosity, or it can understand why it is happening and build around it without making the phenomenon feel artificial. That could mean smarter court assignments, stronger promotion where Filipino communities are concentrated, more accessible player storytelling, and recognition that international fan bases do not always follow the geography printed on the tournament logo. The modern sports audience is global. A player can be thousands of miles from home and still possess the loudest supporters in the building. Eala may be one of the clearest demonstrations of that reality in women's tennis right now. More importantly, her rise arrives while women's sports are competing for unprecedented attention and investment. Archer herself has described the current period as something larger than a short-term moment. If she is right, then athletes capable of connecting new communities to the sport will become increasingly valuable. Eala does not need to become world number one tomorrow for her impact to matter. If she brings first-time viewers into tennis, fills seats that otherwise would have been empty, inspires young players in the Philippines, and creates appointment viewing among overseas Filipinos, she is already expanding the sport's reach. Winning obviously determines how far the phenomenon can go. Continued deep runs would multiply everything. Grand Slam success would take it to another level, but the foundation is already visible. This is not one viral video. It is Washington selling demand around her matches. It is Toronto discovering that a 2,800-seat court may not be enough. It is Cincinnati opponents publicly anticipating a pro-Eala atmosphere. It is respected figures in tennis commenting on the unusual energy. It is the new WTA CEO walking into the job and encountering a player whose fan response demands attention. Claim, evidence, interpretation. The claim is that Eala has become one of the most compelling crowd attractions in the women's game. The evidence is appearing from city to city. The interpretation is much larger. Tennis may be discovering a new kind of global home court star. And now comes the test that determines whether this becomes a fascinating season or the beginning of something historic. The US Open offers a bigger stage, bigger crowds, more media pressure, and stronger competition. Beyond that are future events in Asia, and opportunities where the connection to Filipino supporters could become even more intense. Every step forward raises the stakes. Can Eala keep defeating elite players once everyone expects her to be dangerous? Can she carry national expectation without allowing it to tighten her game? Can the crowds remain a source of energy instead of becoming another responsibility? And can the WTA capitalize on the excitement without reducing a genuine cultural connection to a marketing slogan? Those are the questions that matter now. Because this story is no longer only about whether Eala can win a tennis match, it is about whether one athlete can open a door for an entire new generation of fans and players. It is about a country seeing itself represented in a sport where it rarely had a global singles star. It is about neutral courts suddenly filling with familiar flags. It is about opponents realizing that the player across the net is carrying something rankings cannot express. And it is about a 21-year-old trying to absorb all of that while still competing point by point. Portia Archer arrived in tennis talking about listening, learning, community, fans, and the broader movement happening in women's sports. Almost immediately, she encountered a player who brings every one of those themes together. That is why the Crowd Queen label resonates. Eala is not simply drawing noise, she is drawing belonging. She is not merely collecting supporters, she is connecting people who want to celebrate something together. And if the victories continue, the scenes we have seen in Washington, Toronto, and Cincinnati may eventually look like the beginning rather than the peak. The question is not whether the Eala effect exists anymore, the question is how far it can travel. Does this become a remarkable breakthrough year that fans remember fondly, or are we watching the early stages of the first truly global Filipino tennis phenomenon? And when the biggest stages arrive, will the establishment be ready for the crowds following her, or will Eala keep turning supposedly neutral courts into home territory, one tournament at a time? If you have been watching this rise, make your call. Is Eala already one of the biggest crowd draws in women's tennis, and how far do you believe she can go when the next major test arrives?